Snoop Dogg disguises himself as a homeless person to test the police. What happens next shocked everyone. It was just another day in Los Angeles, or so it seemed. But what was about to happen would leave people speechless. A man, hunched over, walked slowly down the sidewalk, his tattered hoodie pulled over his head, the frayed edges of his sleeves hanging loose around his wrists. His jeans were ripped, not in the fashionable way, but in the way that told a story of wear and hardship. His sneakers were mismatched, one with the sole peeling off, the other stained beyond recognition. In his hand, a crumpled paper bag. He moved with a casual sluggishness, the kind that made people either look right through him or look at him with disgust. The sun was setting over the city, casting a golden glow on the streets, but no one paid attention to him. To the world, he was invisible. Until he sat down. A worn-out wooden bench in a small park on the edge of downtown, near a playground where parents sat on picnic blankets, chatting while their children ran around. Joggers passed by, lost in their music, barely sparing him a glance. A group of teenage boys on skateboards rolled through, tossing a few glances his way before moving on. A businessman in a crisp suit, sipping his overpriced coffee, wrinkled his nose as he walked past, gripping his leather briefcase a little tighter. He reached into his bag, pulled out a simple sandwich wrapped in wax paper, and unwrapped it slowly. He took a bite, chewing methodically, his gaze fixed on the horizon. He wasn't bothering anyone. He wasn't causing a scene, and yet trouble had a way of finding people like him. The sound of tires crunching over gravel, the low rumble of an engine idling. A police cruiser rolled into view. It stopped just a few yards away, the doors opening in unison. Two officers stepped out, their polished boots landing firmly on the pavement. One of them was young. Buzz-cut, muscular, the type who looked like he took his authority a little too seriously. His badge gleamed under the fading sunlight, and his expression twisted into one of annoyance as he glanced toward the bench. His partner, older, stockier, with tired eyes and a coffee stain on his uniform, seemed less eager, but he followed nonetheless. The younger officer, name tag reading Bradley, muttered something under his breath as he adjusted his belt. His partner, Harding, sighed, but said nothing. They walked toward the bench, their steps heavy, deliberate. The man didn't look up. Bradley stopped just in front of him, towering over him. "You can't sit here all day." The man finally glanced up, his face partially shadowed under the hood. His expression was unreadable. "I'm just eating my lunch." His voice was calm, measured. Bradley scoffed, folding his arms across his chest. "Yeah? Well, this isn't a dining room. You got somewhere to go." Silence. Harding shifted on his feet, watching, waiting. Bradley's jaw tensed. "I asked you a question." The man took another bite of his sandwich, chewing slowly, eyes steady. Bradley's patience was already wearing thin. "Look, buddy, people like you make the place look bad. You scare off families, tourists. You think they want to come here and see some guy like you camping out on a bench?" The man swallowed his bite, wiped the crumbs off his lap, and finally spoke again. "Didn't know sitting on a bench was a crime." Bradley took a step closer. "What's your name?" A pause. Then, "Calvin." Bradley smirked. "Calvin what?" The man exhaled through his nose. "Broadus." Something flickered across Bradley's face. Confusion, maybe, or just a hint of recognition. His lips curled into a smirk. "Calvin Broadus, huh? That's a funny name. You a rapper or something?" The man didn't answer. Bradley's smirk faded. "Let me see some ID." The man reached into his pocket, his movement slow, deliberate. Bradley tensed slightly, his hand hovering near his belt. But the man only pulled out a worn leather wallet. He handed it over without a word. Bradley flipped it open, eyes scanning the ID. The name checked out. The address was local. The face on the card, however, looked cleaner, sharper, different from the scruffy man in front of him. He frowned. "What are you doing here, Broadus?" "I like the fresh air." Bradley let out a sharp laugh. "You like the fresh air, that right?" He tossed the wallet back. "Funny, 'cause I think you're looking for trouble." The man caught the wallet, slipping it back into his coat pocket without a word. Harding sighed, stepping in slightly. "Brad, he's not doing anything." Bradley ignored him, his gaze locked onto the man in front of him. "You been to the shelters? They got beds, showers. A place like that's better than hanging around here." "I'm good." Bradley's fingers drummed against the baton at his hip. "You sure about that?" Harding shifted uncomfortably. The air between them was thick, tense. People had started to notice. A woman walking her dog slowed her pace, watching from a distance. A jogger glanced over but kept moving. A father near the playground pulled his child a little closer, eyeing the scene with mild concern. The man on the bench leaned back slightly, folding his arms. "Am I free to go?" Bradley's jaw clenched. He hated this. He hated the way this man didn't seem afraid of him, the way he sat there, calm, unshaken. He wanted to find a reason, any reason, to push harder. Harding exhaled heavily. "He's not under arrest," he said, rubbing his temple. "Let's go." Bradley didn't move. His grip on his baton tightened. "You might want to find somewhere else to sit," he muttered finally, voice low, sharp. The man nodded slowly, his gaze lingering on Bradley a second longer than necessary. Then, with a deliberate slowness, he stood, tucking the paper bag under his arm. He was taller than Bradley had expected. Bradley watched as the man adjusted his hood, a single lock of dark hair falling over his forehead. "Have a nice day," the man said, voice even. Bradley didn't answer. He just watched. Watched as the man walked away, steps slow and measured. Watched as he disappeared down the path, the crumpled bag still tucked under his arm. Watched as, just before he vanished from sight, the corners of his lips curled ever so slightly. Bradley's stomach twisted. There was something about him, something off, something that didn't sit right. Harding clapped him on the shoulder. "Come on, man." Bradley didn't move. Instead, he muttered under his breath, "I don't trust him." Harding sighed. "You don't have to. You just have to leave him alone." But Bradley's eyes stayed locked on the path where the man had disappeared. He wasn't letting this go. Not yet. The afternoon air in the park carried the faint sounds of laughter from a group of kids playing by the swings, the rhythmic tapping of joggers' shoes against the pavement, and the occasional bark from a passing dog. It was the kind of peaceful scene that belonged in a postcard. But the tensions simmering near that worn-out bench told a different story. A small crowd had begun to gather, not intentionally, but drawn in like moths to a flickering streetlight. It started with just a few glances, casual curiosity. Then, people slowed their steps, their attention caught by the unmistakable shift in energy. Officer Bradley stood stiffly, his hand resting on his baton. His face was tense, but not in a way that suggested danger, rather frustration. A frustration that had been simmering since the moment he first laid eyes on the man on the bench. The man who simply refused to look afraid. The woman walking her dog had stopped a few feet away, her brows knitted together. "He's not doing anything wrong," she said, her voice clear but measured. "Why are you harassing him?" Bradley barely spared her a glance. "Ma'am, this doesn't concern you." "It does if you're mistreating someone in a public space," she shot back, tightening her grip on her dog's leash. Harding, the older officer, shifted uncomfortably, rubbing the back of his neck. This was getting messy. People were watching. The man on the bench finally spoke, his voice as calm as ever. "You hear that?" Sounds like folks don't like the way you're handling this." Bradley's jaw clenched. The way this guy talked, so steady, so sure, made his blood boil. Before he could respond, a teenage boy with a skateboard rolled to a slow stop nearby, pulling out his phone. "Yo, what's going on?" he asked no one in particular. Another voice chimed in. "Looks like a cop's pressing a homeless dude for no reason." Bradley turned, his face twisting into a scowl. "You kids move along." The teenager didn't move. "It's a free country, right?" Bradley exhaled sharply. He wanted to shut this down, right now. He turned back to the man. "All right, you need to pack it up and move along. You've had your fun, but you're done here." The man tilted his head slightly, as if considering the words carefully. "I thought this was a public park." Bradley's patience snapped. "You think you're funny?" The man's lips barely moved, but there was something sharp in his tone. "I think I know my rights." That was it. That was the moment. Bradley could feel the heat rise up his neck, the unmistakable feeling of losing control of a situation he should have dominated from the start. His voice came out clipped. "Stand up." A beat of silence. The man didn't move. "I said stand up." Still nothing. Then, slowly, deliberately, he exhaled, set his paper bag aside, and rose to his feet. And that's when Bradley realized something. This man wasn't just tall, he had presence. The people who had gathered around the scene weren't just watching anymore. They were waiting. Bradley squared his shoulders. "Turn around." Harding, who had been silent up until this point, finally stepped in. "Brad, enough." Bradley ignored him. "Turn around, hands behind your back." The man let out a breath, not out of fear, but something else entirely. "Am I under arrest?" Bradley's fingers twitched against his belt. "You're being detained." "For what?" Bradley didn't answer right away. He just stood there, knowing every second that passed made him look worse. "You're loitering," he finally said. A scoff, just a small one, barely audible. "That's interesting," the man said, "because a few minutes ago I was just eating my lunch." Harding pinched the bridge of his nose. He could feel it now, that creeping realization that this wasn't going to end well. The woman with the dog crossed her arms. "Are you kidding me?" Bradley ignored her. "Turn around," he repeated. The man didn't move. Instead, he tilted his head slightly and asked, "What's your name, officer?" Bradley stiffened. He didn't like that question. He didn't like that tone. "You don't need to know my name." The man's eyes flickered just for a second. "Funny," he said. "You needed to know mine." A few murmurs rippled through the crowd. Bradley's grip on his baton tightened. The man adjusted his hood slightly, just enough for a single lock of dark hair to fall across his forehead. "I'll make this easy for you," he said, voice even. "If I'm not under arrest, I'm leaving." Bradley opened his mouth, but Harding cut him off. "Let him go." Bradley turned, incredulous. "Are you serious?" Harding was done. His patience had worn thin. "You're turning this into something it doesn't need to be," he said quietly. "Let him go." Bradley's chest rose and fell rapidly. His nostrils flared, his fingers flexed against his belt. Then, finally, he stepped back. "Fine," he spat. "Get out of here." The man smiled, not a full grin, just a slow, knowing curve of the lips. He bent down, picked up his paper bag, and tucked it under his arm. "Pleasure meeting you, officer." And with that, he turned and walked away, his steps slow, measured. The small crowd began to disperse, but the energy lingered in the air. Bradley watched him go, his fists clenched, his face burning. Harding let out a heavy breath. "You see the way he looked at you?" Bradley's jaw tightened. "Guy thinks he's better than us." Harding gave him a look. Or maybe he just knew what he was doing. Bradley didn't respond. Instead, he stared after the man, his eyes dark, unreadable. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The streets outside the park had settled into a familiar rhythm. Traffic lights flickered between red and green, cars idled in neat rows, and pedestrians moved with the mindless purpose of routine. But in the small pocket of the city where Officer Bradley's frustrations simmered, routine had been thrown out the window. The police cruiser sat parked at the curb, engine humming softly, a reminder of unfinished business. Bradley gripped the steering wheel with white-knuckled tension, his jaw clenched so tight it ached. His partner, Harding, sat beside him, rubbing his temple as if trying to chase away the headache that had been building since their last interaction with the man on the bench. "You need to drop this," Harding muttered, eyes fixed out the window. Bradley ignored him. His focus was locked on the sidewalk ahead. There he was again, the man, the same one. Sitting on another bench a few blocks from the first. Casual, as if he had all the time in the world. He wasn't eating anymore, just sitting there with his legs stretched out, arms resting lazily on his lap. His hood was slightly pulled back now, revealing a little more of his face, but he still had that same unreadable expression, calm, steady, in control. Bradley hated it. "He's up to something," Bradley muttered. Harding sighed. "Yeah, he's sitting." Bradley ignored the sarcasm. His mind was working in overdrive, analyzing, dissecting. This wasn't random. The guy had given a fake-sounding name, refused to leave, then showed up in another spot as if daring them to come back. Bradley grabbed his radio. "Dispatch, I need a record check on a subject, name Calvin Broadus, ID provided earlier." Static, then a response. "Unit 12, no records found under that name, matching the provided ID." Bradley's blood ran hot. "What do you mean, no records?" The radio crackled. "No matches in our system. Could be a clerical error, or the ID is fraudulent." Harding turned his head slowly. "You're really doing this?" Bradley wasn't listening. His pulse thumped in his ears, adrenaline creeping in. "That's it," he said, pushing open the cruiser door. Harding cursed under his breath, but followed. The two officers approached the bench again, their boots hitting the pavement with a new kind of weight. The man looked up, lazily raising an eyebrow. "Missed me already?" Bradley's patience was gone. "You got a fake ID," he snapped. The man tilted his head slightly. "Or maybe your system's broken." Harding exhaled sharply. "Brad!" Bradley held up a hand to silence him. "You lied about your name," he pressed. "That's obstruction. You know what that means?" The man leaned back slightly. "Means you're real desperate to find something." Bradley's face darkened. "Stand up." The man didn't move. Bradley's fingers curled into fists. "I said stand up." A beat. Then, with deliberate slowness, the man rose to his feet. Bradley stepped in, just inches away, his face taut with irritation. "I don't know what your deal is, but I'm gonna find out." The man exhaled through his nose, as if this whole thing was mildly amusing. "Tell you what," he said, "you want to know who I really am?" Bradley's scowl deepened. "Yeah, actually, I do." The man reached into his pocket. Bradley's hand instinctively went to his baton, but instead of a weapon, the man pulled out a sleek black smartphone. He tapped the screen once, then turned it around. Bradley's breath caught. On the screen was a live video feed. Him, his partner, the entire interaction. And next to the video, a real-time counter, 1.2 million people watching. Bradley's stomach flipped. His eyes darted up to the man's face, the smirk that had barely been there before now fully formed. You're—" The man pushed back his hood, and in that instant, Bradley's world crashed. It was Snoop Dogg. For a second, nobody spoke. Harding's mouth parted slightly. His eyes darted between Snoop and the phone, his brain struggling to process what had just happened. Bradley. He felt like he had been hit by a freight train. Snoop's voice broke the silence. "Didn't expect that, did you?" Bradley blinked rapidly, his throat suddenly dry. "This is—" Snoop tilted his head. "What? A misunderstanding?" The crowd that had been forming once again was no longer murmuring in confusion. People were laughing. Some were cheering. Someone from the back of the crowd called out, "Yo, Snoop really played y'all." Bradley's face burned. This couldn't be happening. Harding finally let out a low whistle. "Well," he muttered. "Guess that explains why he wasn't nervous." Snoop turned his phone slightly, adjusting the angle of the live stream. His voice was calm, casual, but there was an unmistakable weight behind it. "See, the thing about power," he said, "is that some people get so used to having it, they don't like when someone flips the script." Bradley's nostrils flared. "You set us up." Snoop's eyebrows lifted. "Nah, I gave you a choice." Bradley's fists clenched. This couldn't be real. "You can't use this," he snapped, his voice coming out more panicked than he intended. "This is illegal. You can't—" Snoop's smirk widened just slightly. "You sure about that?" Before Bradley could respond, another voice cut through the noise. A firm, authoritative voice. "Officers, stand down." The crowd turned. A woman in a sharp navy suit strode forward, her badge clipped to her belt. Her dark sunglasses shielded her eyes, but the way she moved said everything. Internal affairs. Bradley's heart plummeted. The woman stopped just a few feet away, her hands clasped behind her back. "Officer Bradley," she said smoothly, "we need to have a conversation." Bradley swallowed. She held up a hand. "Badge, gun, now." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Harding let out a long, exhausted breath and took a step back. He had seen enough to know where this was going. Bradley's jaw worked, his fingers twitching. "This isn't." "Now." For a second, he looked like he was going to argue. Then, with visible reluctance, he unclipped his badge and weapon, handing them over with stiff movements. The woman pocketed them. "We'll be in touch." Bradley stood there, his face pale, his career unraveling in real time. Snoop exhaled through his nose and shook his head. "Ain't that something?" The crowd erupted. Laughter, cheers, shouts. The weight of it all pressed down on Bradley's shoulders as he turned and walked away. His steps heavy with the knowledge that this moment, this exact moment, would live on forever. Snoop sat back down, stretched his legs out, and smiled. Then, almost lazily, he pulled out his phone and typed a message to the millions still watching. "Change starts with accountability. Keep watching." The crowd was still buzzing, their voices a mixture of disbelief, amusement, and righteous indignation. Some were still processing what they had just witnessed. Others had already turned to their phones, typing out posts, sending messages, and sharing what they had just seen. Snoop sat on the bench, his body language relaxed, but his eyes sharp. He wasn't just watching the fallout, he was measuring it. Officer Bradley stood frozen, his badge and gun now gone, his authority ripped away in a matter of seconds. His face was a storm of emotions, anger, humiliation, panic. He had spent years in the department, rising through the ranks, convinced he was untouchable. And yet, here he was, standing in the middle of a park, stripped of everything that had once made him feel powerful. The woman from Internal Affairs turned slightly, speaking into her radio in a calm, controlled voice. Another officer walked up beside her, nodding as she finished giving instructions. They didn't even look at Bradley anymore, as if he were already gone, as if he didn't matter. Harding, his former partner, stood a few feet away, watching with his arms crossed. He wasn't gloating, wasn't celebrating. If anything, he looked exhausted, as though he had known this moment was coming for a long time. Bradley finally turned, eyes locking onto Snoop. His mouth opened, then closed. His jaw tightened, his hands forming fists at his sides. "You think this makes you a hero?" he finally spat. Snoop barely moved. He just blinked once, slowly before answering. "Nah," he said. "I think it just makes me honest." The crowd erupted again. A few people laughed, others shouted words of encouragement. Bradley's face darkened, but he knew there was nothing he could do. Every move he made now would be scrutinized, analyzed, judged. He took a step forward anyway. "You planned this," he hissed under his breath. "You set me up." Snoop raised an eyebrow. "You set yourself up," he corrected. "All I did was sit here." Bradley's fingers twitched. He wanted to fight back. He wanted to grab control of the situation, flip the script. But there was no script left. It had already been rewritten without him. The woman from Internal Affairs gave him one last look. "Go home, Officer Bradley. We'll be in touch." It wasn't a suggestion. The finality in her tone hit him like a slap. His body went rigid. His breathing was heavy. And then, with no other option left, he turned and walked away. No sirens, no dramatic exit. Just the slow, humiliating walk of a man who had lost everything. The moment he was gone, the energy in the park shifted. The tension that had weighed on everyone's shoulders seemed to lift, replaced with something else. Something electric. Snoop leaned back on the bench, stretching his arms out along the backrest. "Damn," someone muttered nearby. "That was crazy." A young man in a hoodie stepped forward, shaking his head in disbelief. "Yo, Snoop," he said, his voice still laced with shock. "Did you know that was going to happen?" Snoop tilted his head slightly. "Let's just say," he said, "I had a feeling." A woman in a business suit who had been watching from the side crossed her arms. "You really just exposed the whole system in broad daylight." Snoop shrugged. They exposed themselves. Another round of cheers. More people stepped closer, eager to talk, to shake his hand, to just be a part of the moment. The woman with the dog, who had first spoken up when the police had confronted him, stepped up. Her dog, a little terrier, sniffed at Snoop's sneakers before sitting obediently at her feet. "I just want to say," she said, "that was one of the boldest things I've ever seen." Snoop gave a small nod. "Appreciate that." She hesitated for a second. But why do this? Why go through all this trouble? Snoop glanced at the people still lingering around, the faces still lit with adrenaline and excitement. "Because," he said, "too many people go through this every day, but nobody listens to them." The woman blinked. "And you wanted to make sure they listened." He nodded. For a moment there was silence. A silence that held weight, meaning. Then the sound of a car pulling up caught everyone's attention. A sleek black SUV rolled to a stop near the curb. The door opened and a young assistant stepped out, adjusting his earpiece. He held the door open, waiting. Snoop stood up, grabbing the crumpled paper bag from the bench. Before he left, he reached into his pocket, pulling out a folded piece of paper. He placed it carefully on the edge of the bench, smoothing it down with his fingers. A teenage girl nearby, curiosity piqued, stepped forward to read it. Her lips moved as she whispered the words out loud. "To the next person who sits here, your story matters. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." The message hit like a tidal wave. The crowd murmured, some taking photos, others simply staring at it, absorbing its meaning. Snoop turned and walked toward the SUV, his steps unhurried, as if he had all the time in the world. As he climbed inside, he glanced back at the park one last time. People were still gathered, still talking, still thinking. And that was exactly what he wanted, because change didn't start with one big moment. It started with a conversation, a question, a realization. And now? The conversation had already begun.